Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus, doing a matchup breakdown for Modern Burn in particular. The Burn versus Dredge matchup, one of probably Burn's current worst matchups in the format. Due to one particular card being printed, we'll get to that as we go through the matchup. Obviously Burn is the aggressive red-based direct damage deck we are currently covering on the month, and Dredge is a graveyard-based recursion deck with a little bit of other added flavor out of the graveyard, based around the Dredge mechanic, which replaces a draw. You replace your draw step with the Dredge, which is tacked onto the card, and if it's Dredge 2, you would flip over the top 2 cards of your library into your graveyard. If it's Dredge 5, you'd flip over the top 5 cards in your graveyard, and beyond that, uses a bunch of graveyard-based synergies to get creatures onto the battlefield, play spells out of your graveyard, and kind of either bludgeon your opponent to death or kind of grind them out depending on the nature of their draw and what all you're playing against. So for the Burn deck, this is kind of what we're working with. Monastery Swift Spears, Goblin Guides, Eidolons, Skewer the Critics has kind of become the mainstay. Some builds are running Light Up a Stage again to try to get card advantage against things like the Black-Green Rock decks that have been a bit of a mismatch of late. But basically your standard Boros Burn list that is kind of the regular fare key card in the matchup out of the sideboard, being Rest in Peace in this particular build, and also Skullcrack. As far as the Dredge deck goes, so Dredge decks, you have your Enablers, your Shriekhorns, your Faithless Lootings, your Cathartic Reunions to get your cards in the graveyard. Then your Dredgers, you have Life from the Loam, as well as Stinkwood Imp, Golgari Thug, Dark Blast, and the like. The goal is to get prized amalgams into play, either by flipping Narcomoebas into play off your graveyard, or get Bloodghast into play by playing lands, and then getting your prized amalgams back. This deck also has a lot of reach with the cards Conflagrate and Creeping Chill. Creeping Chill allows you to exile it whenever it gets put in the graveyard from your library. Becomes basically a free Lightning Helix. Then Conflagrate allows you to pitch cards to deal damage to either creatures or players. Can be flashed back from the graveyard for red. Often pairs with Life from the Loam, fill your hand up, kind of clear your opponent's board, or just fireball your opponent out of the game. Relevant cards out of the sideboard are pretty much the Nature's Claims and Lightning Bolts. Some lists run Lightning Axe, others in the past have run things like Collective Brutality and such, which will be a card we'll cover in the overall breakdown. Key cards for Burn in the first game are your 1-drop creatures and your Blaze effects. So the best way for Burn to win Game 1 is to get on fast creature start, Goblin Guide, Swift Spear. Eidolon can be effective against their backup plan of Life from the Loam plus Conflagrate, having to cast that card over and over again. But frequently Dredge doesn't involve casting a lot of spells beyond the first couple of turns, so Eidolon loses effectiveness and often becomes a liability when you're trying to race them with burn spells. And then Searing Blaze helps to kind of keep their board under control for a turn or two. Obviously, one of the advantages of Dredge is them being able to get their cards back turn after turn, but Blaze allows you to get a 2-for-1, deal them damage, get a creature off the board for a turn, allows your creatures to swing in, get a chump blocker off the field, get a prized amalgam off the battlefield for a turn, and continue to swing in, because usually your best games, Game 1, are usually a tempo-based winning strategy. Your best sideboard cards are any type of graveyard hate cards. Rest in Peace, Tormod's Crypt, anything that's cheap and can interact with your opponent's graveyard. I've also seen a build of Rakdos recently that ran Surgical Extraction that we played on stream. I was very impressed by Surgical Extraction, being able to snipe for free mana, not having to take a turn off to play a graveyard hate card, and kind of catching your opponent off guard. So I'm definitely going to explore more Surgical Extractions in my other builds moving forward. And then another key card is Skullcrack. This is a card that's been kind of relegated to sideboards a lot of times due to the presence of Skewer the Critics in most burn-based lists. So this comes in to help combat the Creeping Chill advantage that your opponent can have. And then additional card not on this thing, but any type of additional Searing effects. So Searing Blood, any additional Searing Blazes in your sideboard, those cards can often be quite relevant. And then cards you're usually boarding out are things like Grim Lavamancer and Eidolon, cards that either rely on your own graveyard if you're bringing in Rest in Pieces, or Eidolon's just not that effective of a card in the matchup in general. So it can still have some play on some place of play on the play, when your opponent's having to fumble around a little bit if they have a slower dredge draw. But in general, Eidolon's not the greatest card in the matchup. As far as what Burden's game plan is, as I mentioned before, the 1-drops are key. Eidolon's iffy. Some draws with Eidolon are really good, if they're like fumbling around and played like a turn 1, like Faithless Looting and only put like an Amalgam and like a land in the graveyard or something. Or if they're playing the Shriekhorn plan, sometimes Eidolon can be better if they're trying to follow it up with like Cathartic Reunions and such. But in general, Eidolon's pretty iffy. You gotta know your role. Are you having an aggressive start with 1-drops, or are you kind of on a slower like Eidolon plus Burn Spell plan? Then you gotta kind of control the game a little bit, try to keep their creatures off the board as much as possible. Sometimes it's just not possible with their ability to grind. So the other questions you have to ask is, can you control their board? If not, your best bet is just to point their burn at their face and hope to race and hope they don't hit Creeping Chills. Post-board games, the key is still to get on the board quickly. Your 1-drops especially are key, and then back them up with blaze effects. And then the other thing you can do is any type of graveyard hate you have, Rest in Pieces, Tormods, Crypts. Usually bird decks don't play Relic, but any type of graveyard hates, and then knowing when to hold up your Skull Cracks. After turn 2 or turn 3, the dust is settled, they've blown up your graveyard hate piece, they start getting rolling again. Sometimes as a burn deck, obviously you want your prowess on your Swiss Beers and such, but the key is really to prevent them from getting that 3 life from Creeping Chill, and then just kind of try to tempo them out like you try to in your best game 1 draws. Beyond that, so game 1's kind of a little bit of a dog, and then sideboard, it depends on how many of your graveyard hate pieces they see, and how many of their anti-graveyard hate pieces the Dredge sees, as well as how their draws overall go. But in general, this is probably a slightly unfavorable matchup to burn, because of the presence of 4 life gain spells and Creeping Chill, in addition to a fairly proactive game plan from Dredge. Key cards from the Dredge side, any type of early enabler, Faithless Looting, Cathartic Reunion, the Shriekhorn, anything that gets cards into the graveyard fairly quickly. And obviously, Creeping Chill is kind of the card that swung the matchup in Dredge's favor. Dredge is usually about a turn and a half turn slower than Burn in terms of a pure race, so Creeping Chill really swings that in their favor. This is a card that single-handedly swung the matchup for Dredge from being probably pretty unfavorable, similar to Living End for Burn. As far as like having game against Burn, Living End's a pretty easy matchup for Burn overall, to probably Dredge being slightly too heavily favored depending on draws and builds of the decks respectively. Key sideboard cards, Nature's Claim is kind of a generic answer that most Dredge decks have to any type of graveyard-based hate. This is generally a card you want to bring in, also can potentially snipe something like an Eidolon if your Burn opponent leaves that in. So, multiple faceted utility here. You need to be able to execute your Dredge game plan to win. Your regular kind of mopey beatdown plan isn't going to get there against Burn. You have to be able to unlock your graveyard. Another card that doesn't see play quite as much because of the advent of Izzet Phoenix requiring so many tools like Lightning Axe and stuff, but a card that used to see more frequent play in Dredge sideboards and might come back around again is Collective Brutality, which obviously, even for fair decks, this is a pretty good tool against Burn, and the fact that you get to disable or discard Dredgers is a huge plus. Allows you to help negate some of those early starts with Burn's creatures, as well as gain you some life buffer and get some cards in the graveyard, all of which are pluses for Dredge if you have this card in your sideboard, bring it in against Burn. Dredge's game plan, find a good Dredge hand, get a Dredger in the graveyard, see as many cards as possible, be that with your Shriekhorns, be that with your Faithless Lootings, your Cathartic Reunions, Dark Blasting a creature. Usually the Life from Malone value plan is too slow against Burn game 1. not being able to do anything until casting a Loam on 2, dredging on 3, that's just too slow. And then your other thing is to neutralize burns, quick creatures, get your Narcomoebas into play, get your prized amalgams into play, conflagrate their board, whatever it takes to get their creatures off the board or to neutralize them. Do what you can to neutralize burns, creature draws, because generally speaking, your game plan is going to be fast enough to beat their burn the face plan if they're not backing it up with creatures. Post board, play around graveyard hate. Keep a dredger in your hand if at all possible. Like say you have a turn 1 like Faithless Looting and you have like 3 quality cards, like say an amalgam, a dredger, and another dredger. You like put the amalgam and another dredger into the graveyard. Keep your better dredger in hand. You want to play around graveyard hate, things like Rest in Peace. And if they play out an early proactive Tormod's Crypt, you want to force them to, have just enough, whether it be like threatening to bring back a Bloodghast and an amalgam, threatening their with a Creeping Chill activation. Anything that can force them to be just enough to blow those situational graveyard hate pieces, like Tormod's Crypt. Do that to keep them, don't blow your load like turbo dredging like you can in game 1. And then another thing to play around is what was I going to say? Another thing to play around is to know when you can't afford to play around graveyard hate, and also if you have a Nature's Claim, to wait a turn or 2 to start your dredging. If your opponent's like going to tap out on turn 2 for a Rest in Peace, make sure you hold that Nature's Claim for that Rest in Peace. Don't play it like blow it on like an Eidolon or something. You have to have that anti-hate card in your hand to unlock your dredging, because that's how your deck wins. And once again, neutralize burns creatures with chump blockers, conflagrates, collective brutalities if you have them, lightning axe. Anything you can do to slow down burns, 1-drop creatures especially, is vitally important to your game plan, because you tend to win the slightly longer games because you have that extra free life gain from Creeping Chill, and your creatures tend to recur whereas theirs don't. So trading off is fairly valuable for you as long as you keep access to your graveyard. So basically, game 1, dredges fairly favored depending on play and draw, and post board games, know to play around graveyard hate, know to keep the burns creatures neutralized just like in game 1. And in general, this is a closest matchup. I'd probably say, if I had to give percentages, probably roughly burn 45, dredge 55, obviously depending on builds of the deck, etc. But overall, these are kind of the keys in the matchup to both sides of the deck. I hope you enjoy this content. If you like what you're seeing on the channel, please consider subscribing, giving us a thumbs up, and leaving a constructive comment down below. This has been John for MTG Nexus. Thank you, and see you all later.